Hello, I'm sure most people are well aware of the start of UFOs. It occurred on the 24th of June 1947 when a pilot, Kenneth Arnold, who was flying in Washington State, USA, came across an unusual formation of 9 flying objects. He described them as moving like a saucer would if you skipped it across the water. A reporter picked up on this and coined the term flying saucer. A name was born that the public was attracted to immediately. Public interest has never really abated, even 45 years later. Those 45 years have been the story of mankind's greatest mystery. The UFO story has been diverse and extraordinary. This picture was taken on the 16th of January 1958 at Trinidad Island in the South Atlantic. It was one of 4 taken in the presence of around 50 witnesses and released to the world by none other than the President of Brazil. There were stories of crash retrievals, claims that the United States and other governments had captured, accidentally, crashed flying saucers and even recovered alien bodies. There has been great controversy over the meanings of official documents released over the years. Timothy Good's book, Above Top Secret, is recognised as one of the best reviews of this aspect of the subject. There have been tragedies. On the 7th of January 1948, Captain Thomas Mantell chased a bright light, probably to beyond the safe altitude of his breathing equipment. Whatever the cause, Mantell's plane crashed, scattering wreckage over a mile. Ufology had its first martyr. 30 years later, tragedy had not ceased. On the 21st of October 1978, Frederick Valentich was in radio contact with the ground while flying across the Bass Strait in Australia. He was reporting a large green light which was manoeuvring around his plane. In the middle of transmission, contact was lost. Valentich was never seen again. BUFORA's long-time associate in Australia, Paul Norman, of the Victorian UFO Research Society, has spent much of the decade and a half since examining this particular case. There were the claims of the contactees. George Adamski was the first to tell the world that he met with, even flew with, aliens in their flying saucers. That was in 1952, and the controversy rages even today. There were the abductions, of which we shall hear much in this video presentation. Some were exotic, to say the least. And there have been other extraordinary encounters. In August 1955, these hobgoblin-like creatures were reported by no less than 11 witnesses. In January 1970, a little green man, actually there aren't many of them, but this was one, a little green man was reported by 2 witnesses who suffered considerable medical complications from their encounter. In November 1979, this attack took place in Scotland. BUFORA is producing a series of videotapes that explain, analyse and debate the subject of the UFO phenomenon. The subject area is huge, but for the purposes of this first video we are concentrating on researchers, the nature of their research. But we have also included the account of one witness. And I think it's important for you to consider the fact that it may be faltering, certainly free thinking, and it conveys a certain amount of passion in terms of what that person feels has happened to them. But it isn't a rehearsed piece, and they are not reading from a script. It's a real life situation. Other presentations will include witnesses' own stories and testimony, a look at some classic cases, current radical theories, and a host of other facets of the subject. We start with Cynthia Hind, a most extraordinary woman who is the principal investigator on the whole African continent. I asked Cynthia what ufology meant in a culture so different from the technological West in which it first arose to the public's attention?
Well, I think the main thing to bear in mind is the fact that most of the black people are not exposed to the media as such. Not that we don't have radio and television, we do, but we don't get UFO coverage. I think they're a little bit superstitious about it, and so we don't get much from programs here in the UK or even in America telling them. So they're virtually, although they have lots of radio programs, they don't know about UFOs. So when I get a report of any consequence that I follow through, they don't realize we're dealing with UFOs. And at one time, I think it was John Spencer, he made a point that I had told them they were seeing UFOs. That's not true, because I don't lead the witnesses at all. The particular one you're referring to was a fellow called Clifford Muchena, who was one of a group of 20 workmen at a forestry estate, and a man who was one of the bosses there phoned me up, and he was a white man, and he said to me, did I know that they had, some of his workers had seen a UFO? Well, I didn't know, but I went out immediately. It was about 300 miles away, and I drove. I had to stay overnight and interviewed them all, and I just said, tell me your story. And the interesting thing was that they had seen a ball of light rolling across the lawns. It had rolled up a wall and burst into flame, and Clifford Muchena, who was one of the more responsible workers, had run to ring a bell, which was kept there for an emergency. While he was ringing the bell, this ball of flame gathered together, climbed down the wall. Well, they used the expression walked down the wall, went past behind him, and burst into flame again in another place. And when this happened, he was aware of 3 figures standing there. So he quickly ran towards them, thinking that one of them was Andrew Connolly, who was his immediate boss. And he was shouting, Mr. Connolly, Mr. Connolly, to tell him what had happened, when the 3 figures turned around in unison, but slowly. And when they faced him, he saw this brilliant light emanating from the heads, and it was like a power, because he fell to the ground. And I said, but they were 3 meters away from you, about 10 feet. How come you fell to the ground? And he said their power was so strong. Now, when he described them to me, he said they had shiny suits. And you might remember that I told you there's no word in Shona, Mashona, which is their language, for the word silver. So when I wanted him to be more explicit, he took a coin out of his pocket, silver coin, and he said that was what they were wearing. And then I said, Clifford, who did you think they were? And he said, I knew who they were. They were my ancestors, the ghosts of my ancestors. And I said, but your ancestors wore fur and monkey skins and lion's teeth. They didn't wear silver suits. And he thought for a bit, and then he said, well, times change.
It's a lovely story. Cynthia. The remarks you made earlier clearly imply that contamination, for want of a better term, could well play a serious part in the nature of the stories that we get in the West. I mean, clearly science fiction has, I think, played a big influencing part. I think you've got a big advantage that there doesn't seem to be that kind of influence.
No.
Why, though, do you think the natives that you've dealt with think of the kind of events that we regard as UFOs as visits from their ancestors?
Well, that's what they relate to. That's part of their culture. You know, they have several sort of ghost figures in their culture, in the folklore, certainly of Zimbabwe, which I know well. One of them is if you don't, like for instance, if you died in England and you were a Zimbabwean and they buried you in the ground and they didn't put your head pointing towards your home, you would haunt them because you were not satisfied that you were facing where you lived. And then you might get another ghost who feels that he's been badly done by the tribe, and he will come and haunt. But you also get good ghosts who come with good news. They have a variety of supernatural beings who appear, so that ghosts are not offensive necessarily to the African people, and they accept this, but they don't know anything about. In fact, when I said, after we had discussed the whole thing, and I said, have you ever thought it might be anything else? And they said, what do you mean? And I said, well, man has now gone to the moon. There might be, for want of a better way to describe it, there might be people living up in the stars there in the skies. And they said, what do you mean, on the moon? So I said, yes, man has been to the moon. And they said, oh no, only God walks on the moon. So you see, the whole concept is totally different from the way we would look at it.
Well, Cynthia was talking there about ufology in a less technological culture. What about ufology in the most technological culture on Earth? I spoke to Bud Hopkins about the nature of his researches into abductions over the last decade or so. You've written 2 books, Bud. Could we just touch on the subject of intruders and missing time and how you came to write those?
Well, I began to look into these cases, and I began to find these parallels from case to case to case, and many of these cases had what I have called missing time segments, where a whole family in an automobile, the car would stop and the people would see the UFO landing over to the left, and the next thing it would be taking off from the right. Nobody could remember how it got from there to there, and there would be an hour and a half missing. But they didn't remember anything about abductions. We began looking into these cases. I had the friendship of a number of psychiatrists, psychologists, and so on who were doing hypnosis for us and helping us with these missing sections. And I began to realize that this was an extraordinarily widespread, potentially extraordinarily widespread phenomenon. And so this is in the later 70s, and up until that time, we had a handful of abduction cases. We had one in 1966, one in 1973, and by 1975 we had about 3 or 4 more, at least in terms of the public awareness of this. Well, by 76, I myself had quite a handful of these cases. And I began to discover certain features that had never been mentioned before, such as the fact that there were physical scars that conformed to certain patterns that seemed to be the product of these experiences. That also, these experiences began in childhood and seemed to be repeated. And I began to find enough significant patterns that no one had ever remarked upon that I thought, this has to be made public. A book is required. So I, who had never written a book, only painted paintings, made sculptures, sat down and wrote a book, because I had to document the patterns that I had discovered to be of use of for other investigators. And of course I realized it will either be replicated by other investigators or it won't.
And
it turned out
it
was
Intruders.
That was Missing Time.
Oh, sorry.
And then as I began to discover more, as I looked into more and more cases, I discovered this genetic focus of the abduction phenomenon, which we had essentially known from the beginning, but no one, including myself, and maybe especially myself, kind of looked away from, because it's very unpleasant. The idea that sperm and ova sample taking is very central, that there are these very peculiar anomalies having to do with missing pregnancies, and it's a long, complex story. But I had resolved and had sworn to my wife I'd never write anything more about UFOs in a book until there was something important that I had to say that I had discovered. And so this part of the phenomenon I had to make clear in a second book. So Intruders proceeded from that.
Okay. What are some of the clues and indications that indicate to you that a person has had an abduction-type experience?
Well, it's almost, you could call it a syndrome, a collection of symptoms, starting with earliest childhood. And I want to preface this by saying any one of these indications can have very mundane explanations. It's when it's why we do investigations, to find out whether there is a mundane explanation or not. Exactly. But when you put these clues together, you begin to find a collection of symptoms that cohere.
On the 30th of June 1983, Cathy Davis saw lights moving about in her garden. It was to be the trigger of a recall of a lifetime of abductions involving her and her family. Bud Hopkins worked through the case with her the central case of his book, Intruders. The case includes claims of childhood abduction, implanted false memories, artificial insemination, hybrid alien babies, and even a strange bonding ceremony between Cathy and her part-alien children. Even her normal children seem to have been abducted.
First thing I would say is that as a small child, beginning in very early childhood, the child has an inordinate terror of someone that comes in the room at night, some figure, something that occurs during the night. The child will not sleep without lights on, looks under the bed, and discusses these things with parents as if they are real. And the parents will say, "You just had a bad dream." "No, there was a man standing at the foot of the bed with these big eyes," etc. Then, of course, very often the child will disappear and will turn up a few hours later. The child is not crying, is not upset at being lost, hasn't been struggling around for 2 hours, simply doesn't know what happened to the 2 hours. The parents remember this very vividly. It becomes part of family history. And then, of course, very often there is a physical mark on the child. The mother might be undressing her little 3-year-old to put him to bed and finds a deep cut or one of these round circular scoop marks on the back of the leg. The child has felt no pain, there's no blood, there's no tear in the pants. And so the mother obviously is a little concerned. What happened? Nobody remembers. Then you can move on to periods where the child or young man, young woman will develop a terror of a certain location. I can't go in that field. I don't want to be in that stretch of highway. There's something about that window in my room, etc. And these things, these fears are very, very powerful. There, of course, are then dreams where the child will, and the young person, will have recurring dreams which would associate with being on a table, physical examination. This is often accompanied by dread of needles, of hospital situations, which is extraordinarily powerful in some children. And then, of course, you can have UFO sightings as part of this. The whole missing time syndrome that I've just described, which is very powerful and very obvious, is another thing. And, of course, when you get to women, there's often this case of very strange, anomalous events around pregnancies. Now, there are other things, too. But when you begin to collect these symptoms, and they form a pattern, and then the person has a certain psychological profile, which we found over and over again. That is, when we do psychological testing, we find that these people have very low self-esteem, even though some of them are extremely talented. The second thing is that they have a strange kind of detachment and distrust of their own bodies and their own physicality and their own sexuality, as if their bodies have let them down. Now, if these people have been paralyzed and moved, and that's another one of the basic symptoms of the person waking up physically paralyzed and unable to move anything but the eyes and feeling a presence in the room, is a very strong, common symptom. The person will later on have this distrust of his or her own body. And the third thing is a hesitancy to trust other people and a difficulty with relationships. The three basic symptoms, which we get over and over again, and we've gotten these symptoms when we've done psychological testing administered by psychologists who did not know these people reporting UFO experiences. But the psychologists will tell us that these are the sorts of deficits that one gets with rape victims and with victims of violent crimes.
We have heard the views of two very active researchers, and like many, they work in association with larger organisations, but basically they work alone in the field, using their own money, equipment and skills. Research is mostly done by such individuals, but organisations can provide useful backup and coordination of work, as well as acting as repositories for data. Now, I asked Steve Gamble, the chairman of BUFORA, what he felt was BUFORA's most important contribution to research in the subject.
BUFORA itself holds no corporate view as to what UFOs are. There are many theories, and we have many members interested in researching different theories. One of the things that we do in BUFORA is encourage different members to research into the particular theory that they are interested in, and we try to provide support for that. one of the other things that we do within BUFORA is we try to provide technical backup for people's research projects and investigation. It's my personal opinion that one of the problems that we have within ufology as a whole is that they don't have a proper research infrastructure. By this I mean that if I was, for example, employed on a proper scientific project, the first thing I would do is that I would go to the library and I would get a literature search done, find out what other articles or research papers there were in the particular field that I wanted to investigate, find out what other people have done. How they actually do this in modern library systems is through automated database searching, and this is one of the areas where BUFORA has been particularly active. Another similar but not really related area is that we've been building a database of UFO reports, and when I say reports I mean reports which have been investigated by a field investigator. So we have proper detailed information. We are producing computerized catalogues which not only contain things like dates and times, also locations, assessments of the quality of witnesses, assessments of the type of characteristics of the phenomenon. So if someone came to me and said, look, I'm interested in, shall we say, red objects seen over the county of Essex, and let's throw another spanner in the works, the year 1977. I want to know about red objects over Essex in 1977. In the past, the only way you could find what material BUFORA had was to spend 2, 3, I don't know, even longer days searching through our filing cabinet of reports, reading each report, seeing if it was 1977, if it was Essex, if it was a red object. I was able, 2 days ago, just to see how the system worked, on a sample of 1,500 cases, I was able to produce a catalogue of 6 cases, which are red objects seen over Essex in 1977, and I did that in 8 minutes. Not 8 hours, not 8 days, 8 minutes. As subsidiary to this, I also produced catalogues of 297 red objects. I think it was something like 35 reports from Essex and 458 reports for the year 1977.
Okay, Steve, I take the point that modern computerised systems are going to facilitate research and make it a lot easier. But I think a matter of concern is that the standard of UFO reports and the standard of UFO literature has been severely criticised, and I won't name the source, but I've heard a scientist say there is no literature, there is nothing of any meaningful significance. So what's your response to this criticism of the quality of both case material and actual UFO literature?
I think with both the case of literature and with case material, that the quality is variable. But I mean, the dreadful truth is that many of the people that say this literature is rubbish, unfortunately have never really seriously considered the literature. Certainly there are a number of publications on the market which in recent years the quality of the material, the standard has improved. Likewise with case reports, I can go back to the BUFORA archives that we inherited from some of the other groups that joined together to form BUFORA. In the late 50s, early 60s, you would find a small newspaper clipping, maybe not even 1 column inch. X saw a UFO over some place or other. That's what ufologists used to class as a report. What we are classing as reports now We may start from a news clipping. We may start from a witness's initial letter of inquiry. But we now class as reports those where there have been proper field investigation and there has been a complete follow-up on the case. No longer will vague press reports or a letter that my auntie sometime 5 years ago saw something, they no longer count as material. We are doing our best to improve the sources both in literature and in reports. I think I should add that BUFORA as investigators work to a strict code of practice. They have, and each is issued before they are even considered as a provisional investigator, with a document which informs them how to go about investigation, the basic steps they must undertake, and their lines of communication. BUFORA has published and has reprinted a couple of times a detailed manual on investigations. We are doing our utmost to improve the quality of our field investigators, because the old thing, garbage in, garbage out. If you have a poor investigation, then you have a poor case report. And as I say, people that say there is no literature, all reports of rubbish, it is my belief that these people have not really considered the evidence.
Researchers and organisations. But what about the witnesses, who are, after all, what this subject is really all about? Kathryn Howard was with two others, Harry and Melker, in a field in southern Sweden in 1969, when an extraordinary UFO encounter occurred. John Spencer, who has investigated the case, believes it may be the bridge between abduction and contactee cases, and even other areas of the paranormal. This is not a scripted presentation. Kathryn is very articulate, but yet listen to the underlying passions that many close encounter witnesses have to deal with.
I was in southern Sweden with two other people, and we were walking in the countryside, in the meadows, very much like England. Beautiful day like this, exactly. And we had planned to take a picnic. This was more than 22 years ago. And we sat down, we found a beautiful spot, and we sat down, and we started to talk. We were very young, and talking about the world and situations like Biafra and the hunger and the starving children. And we talked about Vietnam, and I was very upset because as an American, I was ashamed that my country was causing such devastation.
This was about 1969, wasn't it?
1969 in April, first week of April. I don't know the exact date, I didn't write it down. And I started to cry because of the situation and what we had seen on the television the night before. And at that very moment that I started to cry, for some reason, Harry did not have the experience, but Melker and I looked up. Something made us look up. I don't know what. And there was this object very close above us that had three things coming down out of it. It was metallic, no windows, no bodies, and soundless, just there. And it didn't even seem to hover, it seemed to just be completely still. But it was only 2 seconds. And then these things went back up inside of it. It was oval-shaped, and it just shot straight out, away from the earth. And I, looking straight up, kept trying to see it, and I said to Melker, "Did you see that?" And he said, "Yes." And we were so shocked because we'd never had anything like this before, and I'd never had any interest in anything of this nature either. And I said that couldn't have been an airplane, because an airplane has to go around the earth, and this thing went straight away from the earth. And then we turned our heads and we looked and noticed that the word sky did not exist. There was no color blue anymore. It was just in infinite space, colorless infinite space. Everything seemed to be enlarged, everything. The human mind, the earth, the space, the consciousness. And then we saw the moon in its natural size, three-dimensional, right in front of us in the space. And it was, it's just impossible to describe, except that a few months later, they landed on the moon and they came with all the photographs of the moon, and that was the only way I was able to describe what I saw. I never could have done it without...
That was in July of that year, the moon landing, wasn't
yes.
it? July 1969.
June or July, yes.
Yeah.
And we saw the craters and the depth of the craters and the size. We saw the color of the moon, which I found not to be gray, but to be like, more like sand, a darker shade of sand. And it seemed to be revolving in space. And then I felt this urge to stand up, which I did. And that was the most spectacular feeling, to stand up and walk on the earth and really feel myself walking on the earth. You know, to feel this. I felt that I was upside down. I felt that I was in every direction. And I seemed to experience gravity in a way I can't describe either. But it was just, I knew what gravity was, and I felt it holding me, that was the only thing that kept my feet on the earth. And all of these things are obvious to anyone, but people don't normally go around and experience it on such an enormous way. And I stood up, I started walking, I felt like a puppet on strings. And then there was a sound that came that permeated the whole space. And it was very similar to if you took a stethoscope and you put it into a recording studio and you magnified it 10,000 times. It sounded like that, like a heartbeat, you know. It had all that echo sound. And it came in boom, and then there was a silence, a gap, and then it came again. And I said, like I knew exactly what was happening, oh my God, it's the rhythm of the universe pulsating. And then I went back and I sat down and put my arms around my knees like this and was looking out, and then I noticed that the earth seemed to get very large. The only way I can describe this is to say that it was two different things at the same time, and that's what's so hard to comprehend with this mind now, how one can do that. But I was sitting here talking to my friend the same way I'm talking to you, with the same physical attributes, but at the same time I was literally somehow seeing the earth from a distance with these same eyes. It was like being an ant on a bowling ball, but at the same time being a giant on the top of a pinhead.
Okay. What is it that you think happened to you?
I feel that what happened to me was that it was an object that came into my space and brought me into their space.
An extraordinary story, but we must never forget the sightings of distant UFOs. For that, let us move across Scandinavia, from Sweden to Norway, from a story of things experienced to one of things seen, from people as witnesses to instruments. In the 1980s, Hessdalen was one of the few long-term study opportunities.
We started up this thing in 1983, trying to scientifically do a research. Hessdalen is a valley situated in the middle of Norway, and in the late 1981, people living there, about 250 people living in that valley, they started to have sightings of yellowish lights passing through the valley. And we had different types of equipment up there. Just to give you some names. We used a seismograph for testing if there were movements in the Earth's crust. We had a spectrum analyzer up there to measure radio waves, IR viewer for heat rays, magnetograph for magnetic field, and of course a radar to see if this phenomenon were visible on the screen. And it showed out to be. We have several cases, which I have also one with me on a video, showing this phenomena on the radar screen. We had special cameras with spectral filters on to measure if this was a solid object or if it was just earth gas or plasma phenomenon. It turned out to be in those pictures we have a solid object.
Well, Mr. Hynek, you are now just about to leave Hessdalen.
Yes.
And this exciting site of the exciting phenomena. What is your impression?
Well, I'm impressed by two things. One is the dedication of the people here that are doing this tremendously fine work, and I'm impressed with Hessdalen itself, because Hessdalen is really a UFO laboratory. It's a place where things are happening and where things can be studied. And I will look forward very much to hearing everything that happens here, and I want you to keep in close touch with me in the States.
How would you put Hessdalen on an international scale, relating to what's happening elsewhere in the world?
Yes, I was just saying that Hessdalen is a laboratory, and of course the laboratory needs equipment and things of that sort. And so I would say, without fear of exaggeration, that Hessdalen has had the best equipment and the best period of operation, of observation of the UFO phenomenon any place in the world. Because while there have been other sightings in other parts of the world, there's not been this amount of equipment brought to bear on that. And that is the important thing, having the magnetometers, the radars, the various cameras, and then staying here for a length of time to do all that. No, there's nothing that compares to Hessdalen. This is by far the best, and that's why I came here.
This is the chance for ufology, or one of the bigger chances for
this
ufology.
This is a big chance, very big chance. This could be, whether it is something paranormal or from out of space, or whether it is a natural phenomenon, whatever it turns out to be, it's terribly important.
We were also helped a good deal by the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment. We had equipment from them, tents. They helped us in many ways. And they also approved this report, which we gave out from the 1984 project. It also contains a good deal of pictures. That's what you asked for. So you have them here, some in colors and some in black and white. We had readings on most of the equipment, but not in all. A Geiger counter, we did not have readings at all. In 1986, the phenomenon died out in Hessdalen, but well, we had a handful, I think, since then.
Hessdalen provided a place where many instruments could be used in UFO study, but the most common instrument is still, as always, the camera. A case in recent years that has been one of the most photographed ever. It involves still photographs, stereo images, 3D images, even video photography. The Gulf Breeze case has been variously described as proof positive and outright fraud. There are claims of alien entities being seen, multiple UFO sightings, of ground traces, and of alien attacks on the witness. It has been a case that has set the UFO world on fire, and has regrettably set many old friends at each other's throats, as UFO researchers lined up in their respective corners with their respective views. Walt Andrus, International Director of the Mutual UFO Network, believes that the case represents alien visitation. Others, perhaps researcher Dr. Willie Smith for example, has most prominently rejected the case as fraudulent. In the end it is a photographic case, and research has centred on the photographs. We will not review the whole case here. Eventually it is likely to be the subject of another BUFORA video, but we can look at the implications of the photography, and I spoke to Walt Andrus and asked him to explain his views.
Well, let's go back. We've had 4 different photo analysts that have worked on the pictures. We know the old style Polaroid camera doesn't even have a model number on it. It's a land Polaroid camera. And this is where you have to pull the film out, then develop it with time, 30 seconds to a minute. And that camera, you can make double exposure, triple exposures, even quadruple if you're so inclined. And Bruce McAfee showed Ed how to do this when he was doing down there on one of his investigations initially. So we don't question that for a moment. But the point is, Ed is not aware of it. There are a few people that accused him of using these shots like that to entertain the teenagers at high school parties there in his home. And he made what they call ghost photos. In most cases, we've duplicated many of them, and simply reflection off of the glass in the playroom. And when that flash comes back, it makes every picture is different with this effect. So there are people like Zan Overall, and Willie Smith claims he knew how to make double exposures years ago, and because until Bruce McAfee pointed out how simple it was to do, then Willie Smith jumped on it. We have to take those pictures we admit could be done by double exposure. If you go into a studio, photograph them against a black backdrop, don't pull your film out. Then step outside and try to center this picture, this object, in a scene, and take another picture and pull it out, and you have your double exposure.
Right.
That's simple to do. There's no evidence that Ed knew how to do that until Bruce showed him. However, we didn't stop there. We sent a Nimzo 3D camera from San Antonio down there, delivered it to Don Ware, who delivered it to Ed. This camera was sealed in wax on the Nimzo 3D camera has 4 lenses. Each time you take a shot, you're getting 4 different images on 2 sets of 35 millimeters side by side. And of course the outside lenses give you the depth perception. The 2 inside lenses won't show much depth.
What controls were put on the issue of the camera to Ed?
We shipped this camera down there. First we did to control it. We never had 2 people always in control of the camera. So he had no chance. But first, loaded the camera in San Antonio, and Tom Dooley, our state director for Texas, also our corporate secretary, MUFON, made one picture off his computer screen with his signature and what it was. That was the first frame. Second frame made sure the film was indeed rolling into the canister. And then he took the back and put wax around the whole back of the camera and took his Navy ones and stuck into the wax. Now, there's no way that that camera will take double exposures. We shipped that camera down to Ed. Bruce McAfee was there at the time, and 12 days before that had been the longest period of time they'd gone without making a photograph. 16 days passed, and Ed had felt the pressure that, hey, wait a minute, these people are going to be sure now that I'm hoaxing these pictures because I've got this sealed camera. So he and Francis started going out to Shoreline Park. In other words, the first time they've actively were seeking something. Before they were trying to get out of their lives because it disrupted the whole family for 6 months. They'd know if they get a night's sleep or not. When something like that happens during the night, you can't even go back to sleep. And it became miserable. It was even affecting his work, taking time away from He's a very successful building contractor, building homes in the area. So they went out to, heard Don Ware give a talk in Gulf Breeze on UFOs, and I said, well, let's go out tonight. And nothing happened. We went out the following night, and the third night, on Friday night, yes, they were in Shoreline Park, just sitting at a picnic bench, and when they saw an object coming in from the Gulf of Mexico, flying right toward Pensacola, with many, many lights. It's hard to say whether it's 50 or 100 small lights, and then some couple real large ones on the side. And Ed figured, when we told him to shoot till you ran out of film. So as this object moved in off the Gulf, he just started following it and just kept shooting until he used up all. There were only 10 exposures left because you're getting 4, using 2 each time you shoot. That was the end, but it got that many shots. Analyzing that picture, well, first Frances said it was real close. She had her contact lenses on, and she said at a distance things are blurred. Ed was looking through the little viewfinder in this small camera, and he looks like a big mother, jokingly. It had so many lights on it. Actually, when Bruce Mackey did the analysis, the 3D analysis, it was about 2.8 feet long, or just about a yard long. That's how bigger it was, and which is entirely different than the objects he had been photographing before, which looked like a big bowl with numerous lights, different arrangements on it. So when that happened, 83 feet away, it proved it wasn't a little Japanese lantern behind the pool, because it was that distance and we knew the size. So Bruce Maccabee instructed Ed how to build a stereo camera so he can separate those lenses at greater distance and be more specific in computing the distance and the size of the object. Build in a calibrating rod 48.5 inches from both cameras. He said, you've got, Ed went out and bought, as soon as Bruce showed him how you could take double exposure, he went out and bought a new Polaroid 600 LMS camera, and so he wasn't being accused of making double exposures. He bought the camera on March 6th, and we have the sales receipt, because we have to document everything in a case of this nature. That's just the way MUFON works. On March the 7th, he got a shot of it right in his backyard, over the schoolyard behind his home, of one of these craft similar to what he'd seen before, with a big orange ring, light on the bottom side, light up on the top. So, hey, this is good. We had put the Polaroid engineers to work on it. How can you take a double exposure with a new 600 LMS Polaroid? Because the film comes in a little metal pack, and you would have to cut the foil out and go in there. And it took the engineers 2.5 months to figure out a way of dismantling the camera, make it inoperative, unload it, make your picture, and repackage it and put it back in the camera. But Ed was so brilliant that he figured that all on one day, from March 6th to the evening of March 7th. So that gives a lot more credibility to the gentleman in making the pictures.
What we have looked at so far in the interviews in this video is what might be called the traditional investigation of UFOs. The Vice Chairman of the British UFO Research Association is John Spencer, and he differs with this traditional view. Indeed, he believes that the term UFO may be outdated or even totally meaningless.
What I've said is that I think that we've put artificial boundaries around this term UFO, and we've included certain things in it, and we've said certain things don't apply to it. Now, the things that we've included inside this term UFO include, for example, the distant encounters, the night lights and the daylight discs, and also the close encounters where we're dealing with people meeting aliens and perceiving interaction with aliens. There may be no connection between those two. There's a whole world of difference between a passing sighting of something very distant and someone saying, I was inside a flying saucer and I was meeting with the alien pilots or having these abduction experiences. And there may be very little way that we can investigate the two in the same way. The investigation methods are different, the witness reaction is different, the passions involved are different, possibly the underlying meaning is very different as well.
Well, John, if you could break down the barriers around the term UFO that you don't like, what exactly would that add to the subject?
It would mean that we were concentrating on the difference between what people were seeing and what people were experiencing, and that means, I think, that we'd begin to be able to leave the ETH behind, this extraterrestrial hypothesis, and leave us more free to look at other possibilities.
Well, John, how exactly would that work?
Well, the traditional view of flying saucers, if we take the ETH, is that the flying saucers are spaceships controlled by alien pilots from other planets, and therefore their appearance here on Earth is quite random, at least as seen from our point of view. They are, in effect, a sort of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin of another world. They seem to be like doctors. They're coming here. It seems that their job is one of genetic manipulation, from what we're hearing from the abductions. And our role as investigators on that basis would seem to be simply to investigate what they're doing, possibly to try and predict when they're going to do it next, with a view presumably to either stopping them doing it, capturing them while they're doing it is maybe one aim, at the very least tapping them on the shoulder at an appropriate moment and saying, look, do you think we could discuss this in some way?
Yes. Well, John, I think you've always been rather sceptical about the extraterrestrial hypothesis, haven't you?
Yes, about it in its traditional form at least, yes. There are so many difficulties. If we just go through them very quickly, and we really can't cover it in a short interview like this, but the conspiracy theory that is so popular, it really doesn't gel with the way that conspiracies that we do know have been exposed have unfolded. People are not acting in a logical way. I'm not talking about the aliens. I mean, I accept we may not understand their logic if they exist there, but people are not acting logically given the circumstances of this, and that would take a long time to explain, but we've looked at it a lot, and I'm not sure that people are. The development of the aliens is even a sort of a development where they're getting more alien and doing more alien things, almost like a Hollywood sequel demands more of the next film along. So it's very scripted in that way. This whole thing reflects basic human fears. You've got the fears of kidnap and loss of personal control. Everyone in an abduction situation reports this loss of bodily control. Bud Hopkins has referred to the fact that people think their bodies have let them down. This is a very basic human fear. Jacques Vallée has pointed out that if they are doing what the traditional model of the ETH says they're doing, then they're very bad pilots because they crash a lot. They're very bad doctors because they can't even do surgical operations to the standard we could do. They're very bad hypnotists because anyone with a gold watch can bring the memories through. They're not very ethical doctors in that they're not concerned, if you like, for the well-being of the people, or they may regard us as very subhuman in that way, or sub whatever they are. So I suppose that's a possibility. Then you've got crash retrieval, shows an inconsistent technology, a technology which can move a human being physically through a wall, which is something which is reported, seems very vulnerable to being struck by lightning and bouncing all over the New Mexico desert. Now again, maybe that's the case, but if it is the case, we need to be able to understand why it's so inconsistent, and this kind of very down-to-earth, practical model of the ETH simply doesn't answer all those questions. I think the ETH is a human construct. It's constructed to answer the questions we've got rather than looking at the real details that are there. If we look at animals in the world around us, I know that we personify their actions, particularly pets, for example, but actually we can't really communicate with animals. We certainly have no way of communicating with spiders and butterflies and ants and moths and such. We really don't know how they view the world. We think that certain animals are intelligent because they do things the way that we would do things, and that we then say, oh, that must be intelligent because they're copying us. Actually, that may be their lowest level of intelligence. There may be whole aspects to intelligence, to the world around us, that we have no real idea of, that we can't even dream of. And that may mean that in fact we are not the most intelligent, that you know, the world itself may contain aspects which are more intelligent than us. Now on that basis, if we can't understand the animals that have grown up in the world around us, can we really believe that we can understand a totally alien culture with totally alien objectives coming to this planet? I don't believe we can. In the book Perspectives, I said we needed a new model to view the subject with, and I think we still need that new model.
Now, John, you talk about things that we can't even dream of. Now, is that through lack of imagination, or are we talking about things that we can't dream of because they're from the perspective of some sort of alien logic, for want of a better term?
Well, firstly, we may be talking about something which is truly alien to the Earth, or maybe just alien to humanity, things that we've lost touch with around the Earth. In the sense that it may be alien to the Earth, of course, I'm accepting a possibility of something extraterrestrial, but not this kind of traditional model. But let me come back and look at what I say we can't even dream of. Let me explain how things, or let me offer how things are perceived by people. If you see a car, for example, what your mind does, it has a model in the mind already of something that you've learnt is a car. You see this thing and you make comparisons. You go into the sort of card index in your head and you say, oh yes, that was one of those, therefore that is a car. But what happens if you don't have a model in the brain when something happens to you? I believe these experiences, particularly the close encounters, are very genuine. People genuinely are experiencing something. But when they start searching in the card index in their head for something to compare it to in order to say it was that, there's nothing there. It's interesting, Cynthia, I think, speaks about Clifford. Now, he comes from a different culture. He doesn't have Star Trek on TV every night where he lives. And he sees the same things, he's having the same experiences, but what he came up with was the spirits of his ancestors. So that was his model that was in his mind. Now, there is a problem with this. If you haven't got something in the head already, in your card index already, you find the thing that it was like, and then you begin to construct the facts to fit the model. You begin to adapt what you think you saw. And the problem then is that you've got this very genuine experience, which is genuinely happening, but you become slightly unreliable as a witness, because what you're doing is you're adapting the facts to fit what you've got in your head.
So, John, you're taking the view that UFO encounters are real, but more from a paranormal perspective than the so-called traditional model of UFOs supposes.
Exactly that, in fact, yes. I mean, I've probably done more research than most UFO researchers into areas around the paranormal which may be interactive with UFOs.
What other areas of the paranormal do you feel that the subject of UFOs includes?
I can't think of any that it may not or should not encompass as a possibility, and as I said to you, many of them may in fact be turn out to be quite inappropriate, but until we actually try it, we won't really know. You've interviewed Kathryn Howard, I think, already, and
yes.
Kathryn's a case that I've dealt with for many years. Now, her case involves whole areas of the paranormal. I've mentioned reincarnation, revelation, clairvoyance, ESP. Even while working with me, she has there are many coincidences between us which actually stretch back to before the time we ever even met. And I mean, coincidence is now becoming recognised as a paranormal area in its own right for study, and I think rightly so as well. Electromagnetic effects. I mean, I've had tape failures when I'm trying to interview Kathryn in quite bizarre circumstances. I mean, as does happen in this subject, doing ghost research and such, it happens there too. I've had telephone systems, whole telephone systems collapsing at very inappropriate moments, which is actually very strange, very difficult to explain all of that here. But all of these things seem to be part of her case. They may not be part of their case, they may be quite random, they may be quite inappropriate, but any research which looks at the case and starts by saying this is not right, this is right, or this is appropriate, this isn't appropriate, is beginning to channel that case down a certain road. And what I want to do is be much more open about the possibilities and give the witnesses a chance in a way to prove the case on their own grounds without saying, well, I'm not going to listen to that bit, or I'm prepared to listen to that bit. Let's try listening to all of those bits, and that means in most cases we must be more open to what is generally known as the paranormal.
Well, as we have seen, this is a far from simple subject. It has much controversy and much variety, and we should never forget that it is a global subject. Our last interviewee, John Spencer, is the author of this book, UFOs, the Definitive Casebook, which is a world review of UFOs continent by continent, with essays from prominent experts on each continent. It is a book which, more than most, shows the global similarities and variations of this intriguing subject. Many of the illustrations used in this video were taken from the book. Just leafing through the book shows the enormous scope of the subject, facets of the UFO phenomenon that we will be covering in later BUFORA videos. We hope that BUFORA books and this series of videos will help you to appreciate what UFO researchers discovered years ago, that this is mankind's greatest mystery.